Hi there, Ali. Brian, also known as Stronzo5785 from a nondescript little town in the southwestern part of the United States. Thank you very much for your video. Very good. It's good to know that somebody knows why they believe as well as what they believe. I'd still like to see, I'd like to see quotes. I'd like to see somebody who is a Muslim source their assertions. I rarely hear that. If you could possibly point me in a direction where I can find these sources, that would be great. I'd like to look at them for myself. Also, let's address, while we're on the subject of sources, namely the Quran and the Hadiths and the Sira and the Tafsir and all the other myriad books that I have to read in order to understand the Quran, why do you suppose God would do business that way? I know you like to, I know that Allah is presented as not knowable, but He's also the loving, the compassionate, the merciful. All three of these, for a mathematically one God, all of these require a subject and an object. This, to me, would make Allah contingent upon His creation. He would need His creation to be the merciful, the compassionate, the loving, the forgiving. That doesn't gel. As far as the scientific items that I see in the Quran, it talks about mountains being placed in the Quran. I don't have the quote myself. I apologize for that, because I just asked you for your quotes, and I'm unable to source my assertions. But nonetheless, it is mentioned in the Quran that mountains are placed there to stabilize the earth, to make earthquakes go away. The problem with that is that where there are large mountains that are growing, you're going to have what? Tectonic activity. Tall mountains, the Himalayas, for instance, there are daily earthquakes there. The ground shakes constantly because these mountains are growing. Just one example of a scientific assertion by the Quran that is completely false, totally false. And by your definition, because that one assertion is completely false, would indicate to me that people did rewrite and edit the Quran. There's other evidence for this as well. The majority of the story, or a lot of the stories, not the majority, a lot of the stories, no, I will say this, the majority of the stories in the Quran come from the biblical compilation, come from Jewish Talmudic writings, come from Jewish children's stories, and there's a large portion of the poetry that appears in the Quran that is actually Syriac poetry, and some of them are even Syriac Christian hymns. Yikes. This kind of calls into question the veracity or the validity of the claim made by Muslims that the Quran is inimitable, that it is perfect. If we can source passages of the Quran from earlier writings, then how can we believe that God really gave this work to Muhammad? I can't believe it. Let's talk further about the cultural thing. I don't hate Muslims. I don't hate Islam. I simply examine it from the outside looking in. I look at your sources. I look at the claims made by the Quran and examine it and compare it with scientific thought and philosophy and earlier theological works as well, and I find it coming up short. That's one reason why I'm not Muslim. The second reason is that it doesn't make sense. God, the God of the Quran, is an angry, at times angry and capricious, and will deliberately lie to people. The God of the Bible never did that. If anything, God in the biblical compilation gave us exactly what God was thinking, the way He was thinking, why He was thinking it. And there's some violent stuff in there. There's some angry stuff in there. God is getting angry in our presence and telling us why He's angry. Isn't that the action of a gentle, kind parent? You see your dad getting mad and he doesn't tell you why he's getting mad. He just is mad. Isn't that abusive? Don't you wonder as a child, did I do something? God tells us in the biblical compilation why He's angry. And that's it. That's simply the way it is. I think it's gentle, and I find it loving that he would do this. In the Quran, the times that God did lie to us, the Quran and in the Hadiths, when God lies to us, he doesn't tell us why. And I think it comes down to the name of the faith, submission. We need to submit and cower to God because God wants slaves. The idea of the Christian God, however, is a father-son, mother-daughter, a parent-to-child relationship. God wants us to be dedicated to him because he is good and his mercy endures forever. Not because he said it's this way and that's the way it is. To me, that's a capricious statement, and it's made all through the Quran. I can't be a Muslim. I don't want to think about God being that way. The final thing, and this is the part that disturbs me the most about Islam, is the double-sidedness of the faith. You've got one branch of Islam speaking one thing and acting in one way. Then you have the other side of Islam speaking another thing that's diametrically opposed. The very definition of jihad, it's either violence or war against oneself, or it's war against those who are not Muslim. What is it? Can it be both at the same time? Is it both at the same time? I read verses like Sura 4, ayat 34, and wonder, wow, God wants us to abuse our wives? Or I read Surah 9, verses 29 and 30, and I think, well, wait a minute. The Jews, Ezra is anything but a Christotype, an Old Testament Christotype. Anything but that. Ezra was the hated son and brother of Jacob. Ezra's not going to come back and represent God. Ezra, you got it wrong. The Quran got it wrong. I honestly believe that if you understand what Christianity is about, it's not about sin. It's about Jesus. It's about why Jesus came. Jesus came, put himself on that cross, and allowed this to happen as God on earth, in the cloak of man, in the cloak of humanity, to be a sacrifice for that which separated us from God. Jesus sacrificed all so that I could be a child of God. I'd much rather be a child of God than a slave of God. That's it. I hope you do include this in your video responses, and I look forward to any responses which happen as a result of this. In the meantime, I wish you peace, joy, and love in this life.